Good evening, Duelist. Welcome to my long-awaited Cyber Dragon deck profile video. I'm going to get right into things here. 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. Now, the reason you play 3 copies of this card is because you want to maximize your chances of getting cards like Clockwork Knight to resolve effectively, cards like Machine Dupe, cards like Duality, cards like Power Bond. So playing 3 cards of this is great going second because it's a free special summon. It's also just a great way to grind out games if you need to grind out games. It's also a great way to have the materials to OTK your opponent right away if you need to do so. Seeing 2 copies of this card in your hand isn't really harmful as long as you see cards like Power Bond or cards like Clockwork Knight or cards like Duality. In those scenarios, it's almost always beneficial to see not just 1 copy, but 2 copies of this card in your hand. But the odds of having 2 cards in your hand when you run 3 copies of it in a 40-card deck is pretty low, so you don't need to worry about it too much anyways. But if it does happen, it's not the end of the world. In fact, it can be a good thing. 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Core. This card has a really good effect in the graveyard. Its normal summon effect is actually overrated. Its normal summon effect doesn't really do much of anything. You kind of need 2 or 3 other cards in your hands in order for it to work. You also need it to not get negated in order for it to work. That's just asking for a lot already. However, this card is Cyber Dragon on the field and in the graveyard, so it's a good Machine Dupe target. Like I said, its graveyard effect is very powerful. After you've drawn out your opponent's negates, and if they left your front row clear, you can use it to revive back your big monsters from the graveyard. So I absolutely love playing 3 copies of this card. Like I said, we're trying to maximize the number of materials we have for Power Bond, for Machine Dupe, for Clockwork Knight. With that said, we play 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Hers. This is the better core, in my opinion. This card gets your Cyber Dragons from the graveyard back into your hand. So if you're using the graveyard a lot, it's really great. It's also, of course, a Machine Dupe target. But one thing I really like about Cyber Dragon Hers is it allows you to chain block Chimeritic Rampage Dragon's effect, which is probably one of the most powerful things Cyber Dragons could ever do. If you activate Power Bond using a Hers as material, you send it to the graveyard, you can go Chain Link 1, Rampage Dragon, Chain Link 2, Cyber Dragon Hers, and now your opponent can't do anything. They lose their back row, they lose their front row. They can't do anything about it. You can also use this card in tandem with Rampage Dragon's effect to search for a Cyber Dragon core if need be. 1 copy of Nashter. You only want to play 1 copy of this because ideally you want to leave it in your deck. You don't want it in your graveyard or in your hand turn 1, so that you can use your core effect for follow-up on your opponent's turn. That way you can revive back Nova, Infinity, or your Cyber Dark Chimera. Speaking of, we play 1 copy of Cyber Dark Chimera. It can be revived back with Nashter. We can also use this card to make a Cyber Dragon core turn into Rampage Dragon all by itself, as long as we can discard a Spell or Trap card to search for the Power Bonds. So, Rampage is really strong. It can be revived by Nashter. We can also make it using our Cyber Dark Chimera. So that's why we play 1 copy of each of those cards. We play 1 copy of King Regulus. I don't really want to see this card in my hand ever. I kind of want to search it out with a specific combo. So if you use Clockwork Knight, you can make 2 Fortress Dragons, then use those to go into Gigantic Champion Sargus. Search your King Regulus, and then go into the battle phase, so that in main phase 2 you can make Sky Thunder Zeus along with a King Regulus on the field for that added, interruptions on your opponent's turn, so that you can win that grind game pretty easily. And, of course, clear your opponent's board. 1 Dino Wrestler Bankratops. It's really cool that he's a dinosaur monster that pretty much summons himself for free every time. He can pop our opponent's back row or front row. If you see this card against Kashtira, it usually wins. But he's also nice to just leave on the field sometimes, because if your opponent has Tikaboo in the back row, they might think that you're trying to out their Tikaboo with this card, but in reality, you can just leave this card in the field along with a King Regulus or another big machine monster, and Salamangreat Almirage as well, and then you can just actually play under There Can Be Only One quite effectively. Onto the spell cards. So, the most powerful Cyber Dragon card. Again, this is my opinion, but I have playtested this deck quite a bit, and I think the best card in Cyber Dragons is Power Bond. No question about it. This card just wins duels all by itself for absolutely no reason. It is stupidly powerful. It doubles the attack of the fusion target. You will take that damage at the end of your turn, but you normally kill your opponent the turn you use it anyways. This card is just polymerization, but for machine fusion monsters. And like I said, it doubles their attack. And so when you play this card, you're able to get your Rampage Dragon on the field, and then if you have hers, of course, you can go for that chain block ability that I mentioned earlier. 3 copies of Cyber Emergency. I should go without saying, this card is super strong because it allows you to be consistent with your Power Bond, it allows you to be consistent with Forbidden Droplet, with Clockwork Knight, with Duality, with Machine Duplication. You've got to play 3 copies of Cyber Emergency. Then 3 copies of the Myth, the Legend, Clockwork Knight. This card is super strong. Of course, it allows you to go for your Contact Fusion Summon plays. But I also want to mention, when you use Power Bond, okay, one of the goals of using Power Bond is to get your Cyber Dragon monsters into the graveyard. Cards like hers, cards like Core, so that you can, if your Power Bond, your monster that you fusion summoned gets removed from the field, you can follow up with a Cyber Dragon special summon, or a Cyber Dragon Core normal summon, or of course use Core's graveyard effect to bring out a Nashter and revive your Rampage, or whatever. And so having those materials in the graveyard is great for Clockwork Knight in particular, because when it's on the field, you can then use any of your Cyber Dragon monsters to go into your Chimeratech Fortress Dragon. So, a very strong card. It does occasionally search your deck for Therion King Regulus, which can come up, although it doesn't happen very often. Forbidden Droplet. This is, I think, the most powerful board breaker in this deck. It's not the most consistent because if you have a Macrocosmos on the field or your opponent has a Rise Heart in the field, you can't use it. But usually you can out those cards first and then use it, which is really great. Forbidden Droplet along with Power Bond gets your Cyber Dragon cards in the graveyard, and that's good if you have to grind the game out, of course, obviously, but it's also really good because you can then use those materials in the graveyard to do other things if you're trying to OTK as well. And of course, Forbidden Droplet has the attack of the opponent's monsters. They can't react to it with their monster effects typically. And so it's just a very strong card. And it's needless to say, it can go first as well. You can just set it in your back row and use it that way. It's a good card to use in tandem with Cybernetic Overflow because you can kind of double up on the materials that you use to negate / destroy your opponent's cards. So 3 copies of that is really good. In addition to Forbidden Droplet, play Book of Moon as a board breaker. Shout out to Yassine for giving me the idea to use this card. He talked about how good it is at stopping decks like Pearly, decks like Kashtira, and of course any deck that summons monsters. It can be very effective. Just note, you can't always use your opponent's monsters as fusion material with Clockwork Knight, but ideally, when you use Book of Moon, you're not really needing to get those cards off of the field anymore. They've already been dealt with, so you can go for your OTK play. Of course, if you have Cyber End Dragon, you can also attack an opponent's monster in defense position for piercing battle damage. But Book of Moon's really good as a quick play spell. You can chain it to the activation of a card like Anti-Spell Fragrance. So, very good card in Book of Moon. Play 2 copies of Machine Duplication. I was playing this card at 3 and Duality at 1, and then I realized that Duality can do pretty much everything Machine Dupe can do, except Duality does it with a level 5 monster, Machine Dupe does it with any of your little Cyber Dragon monsters. And so there's just a lot of pros and cons to both cards. Machine Dupe is great because it's not a once per turn effect. You can play both on the same turn if you want. You do need your Cyber Dragons in your deck to play it, so sometimes this isn't the best card to see late in the duel. But if you're anticipating your next play and you're managing your resources well, Machine Dupe will always be your friend. And having Nova and Infinity on the field is really great. But we don't need to play it at 3 copies necessarily, because like I said, Duality can actually do the same thing by going into Cyber Dragon Infinity. It also allows us to draw a card. And Duality, of course, is the way that we cheat out our Chimera Rampage Dragon. This is really helpful if we need to see Cyber Dragon Core in our hand. It's also very helpful if we have Siger on the field, Cyber Dragon Siger, and we can cheat out with Duality. We can cheat out Rampage Dragon and then have a 4200 beat stick that can attack 3 times, just like if we used Power Bond to summon it. I really like how this card shuffles back cards that are dark and light back into our decks, because it allows us to only play, 1 or 2 copies of Chimera Fortress Dragon, 1 or 2 copies of Chimera Rampage Dragon, 1 or 2 copies of Mega Fleet. We can manage our resources and grind the game out with Duality because it keeps putting those fusion monsters back into our deck. Or if we want to put Cyber Dragon Core back in our deck, we can do that too. You can do a lot of things with Duality's graveyard effect. So, very strong card at 2 copies. Highly recommend playing that and Machine Dupe at 2 copies each. It is a hard once per turn, Duality's effects. Speaking of hard once per turns, we have Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm is an awesome card because it can remove our opponent's back row just like Harpy's Feather Duster. And it gets itself off of the field after we use it, which is really cool because we can then, use cards like Dynaris or Pankratops. We can use cards like Cyber Dragon, because most of those cards only work when we don't control monsters and such. So the fact that this is a spell card that can just clear opponent's boards without staying on the field is really cool. Also play 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster. This card's really strong, obviously. It just beats Labyrinth when you resolve it normally. So play Harpy's Feather Duster along with the Lightning Storm. 1 Called by the Grave. It is a good card if your opponent is going for the Gimmick Puppet block. In my side deck, I play a lot of copies of DD Crow as well for that reason. It's also a card that you can set if you have to go first. 1 copy of Cyberdark Realm. This card makes Cyber Dragon Core go into Rampage Dragon, a properly fusion summoned Rampage Dragon that has double the attack because it searches Power Bonds. It can also get an extra body on the field, an extra normal summon, which is sometimes relevant, not usually, but very cool card in Cyberdark Realm. 1 copy of Instant Fusion. So Instant Fusion is really cool. You can use it first, if you're going first to make Nova/Infinity. You can use it second to make Nova/Infinity. The way you do that, of course, is with Panzer Dragon. You can also just leave the Panzer Dragon on the field because Instant Fusion will destroy it during the end phase. And that way you can use Panzer Dragon to pop one of your opponent's cards. And because if you play Panzer Dragon in your extra deck because of Instant Fusion, you can also summon it out with Duality. So if you have your Chimera Rampage Dragon on the field and it's about to get destroyed, you can then chain Duality to tribute your Rampage Dragon, summon Panzer Dragon. Your Panzer Dragon will get destroyed, and then you will get to destroy one of your opponent's cards. So that's just a really cool trick. I also played Millennium Eyes Restrict as an honorary copy of Called by the Grave. It's also just good at board breaking. If your opponent wants to negate something with one of their big monsters, you can steal that big monster with your Millennium Eyes Restrict. 1 copy of Foolish Burial. It acts essentially as an extra copy of Cyber Dragon Core, as an extra copy of Cyber Dragon Hers. And that's just, having Core and Hers at 4 copies each in a Cyber Dragon deck is pretty awesome. So definitely play Foolish Burial. It's a good card in this deck. Also doesn't turn on Droll and Lockbird, which is cool. 1 copy of Overflow, because it's sometimes relevant to search it if our opponent has successfully set up floodgates and we just don't have the outs like Lightning Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster. We can use our normal summon to search for Overflow and then escape from our opponent's oppressive strategy. Now onto the extra deck. For the Link monsters, I play 1 copy of Almirage and 1 copy of Seeger. Very strong cards. Almirage is great under There Can Only Be One, and Seeger is a good card. He's Cyber Dragon on the field. Really, the best use of Siger is to make Cyber Dragon Core a 1-card combo for the Power Bond to resolve successfully. I'll go over tips, tricks, and combos in my next video. I'll show you guys that combo, of course. 1 copy of Nova and Infinity. I was going back and forth on how many copies to play of these cards. I decided on 1 each because they're both revivable with Master. You can put them back into your extra deck with your Duality, and that's just not much of any reason to play more than 1 copy of these cards because they can be revived, like I said. Also, if you need to hard summon them properly from the extra deck more than once in a duel, you're probably going to lose the duel. Occasionally it'll come up so that you can play 2 Infinities. You revive your Nova back from the graveyard, and then of course go into Infinity, and that way you have a Zeus that has a lot of materials. But I just felt that strategy was a little too gimmicky. It took up a little too much space in my extra deck, and I think you can use those slots in your extra deck a little bit better than playing, 2 copies of each or 2 copies of one or the other. And I found these 2 cards in particular to be good at that. Champion Sargus can search your Regulus and then go into your Sky Thunder Zeus. The way, of course, that you summon your Sargus is by summoning 2 Chimera-type Fortress Dragons to your side of the field. And you'd be surprised how many times this came up and was just a viable way for me to clear my opponent's board. So, I highly recommend playing those 2 cards. Onto the fusion monsters. I already mentioned Millennium Eyes Restrict, the Panzer Dragon, 2 Rampage Dragons. It's just nice because I found myself having the ability to resolve power bonds twice a lot. So it's good to have 2 of those cards so you can resolve both power bonds, have 2 Rampage Dragons, and that way if your opponent survives somehow, that would be a miracle. But if they do survive that, you can go into Nova/Infinity if you want. It's also worth noting that Rampage Dragon's effect that gives him more attack is a soft once per turn, which means that if you summon both Rampage Dragons on the same turn, you can use both of their effects to get 6 attacks during your battle phase. The 2 Fortress Dragon, because of Duality, we don't need to play more than that. And because of Duality, we want to play a Twin Dragon for sure, and an End Dragon for sure. End Dragon is cool. If you can Power Bond summon this card and your opponent has a monster in defense position with 0 defense, then you actually just go in the battle phase and win with your Cyber End because it'll have 8,000 attack and it inflicts piercing. So you can kind of spoof your opponent some duels with that. Cyber Twin Dragon is, of course, how you would OTK with Duality. It's very hard to do that. It doesn't come up very often, but it is possible. Of course, Chimera Tech, Mega Fleet Dragon. And that's it for our extra deck. Now onto my side deck, which is honestly more important than most side decks I've ever played with. So, Cyber Spell Traps in my side deck. I play 1 Repair Plant and 1 Cyberload Fusion. This is good going first because you can use it in tandem with Cybernetic Overflow to pop 4 of your opponent's Spell Trap cards, which is pretty cool. And of course the Repair Plant because I play Galaxy Soldier, and that's of course for going first. I also play 3 copies of Solemn Judgment for going first. Solemn Judgment is just self-explanatory for going first because if you're going against a Spell Trap deck, you can just go first and then you can set this card, and that's pretty much a guaranteed way to shut down your opponent's back row strategy. In addition to Judgment though, going first, I play Cosmic Cyclone. Yeah, you could play more Spell Trap removal and still go second with Cyber Dragons, but against a deck like Labyrinth that really loves going first, it's sometimes better to just pick to go first yourself, play the Judgment, play the Cosmic Cyclone. 3 copies of Nibiru. Nibiru is really good against a lot of combo decks. Some of the combo decks can set up Baron before they get to their 5th summon, but a lot of players don't set up Baron before their 5th summon, so Nibiru is just there to keep our opponent accountable and make sure that they're playing the deck to the best of their abilities, otherwise they're going to lose. 3 copies of DD Crow. DD Crow is really good because of Dark World, which can hand rip you for 5. But if you have DD Crow, you can kind of shut that down by banishing their Silva from the graveyard, or their Cerulean, I guess. So yeah, DD Crow is a pretty universally good card. It can also banish spells and traps from your opponent's graveyard, which is sometimes relevant, like with Pearly. So yeah, DD Crow is a pretty good sleeper card, and I find it a very nice addition to Cyber Dragons. That's it for this video, you guys. I will be going over some combos and tips and tricks in my next video. But until then, have fun building Cyber Dragons, and hopefully you learn things in this deck profile. And if you have any criticism or tips or anything that you want to suggest, just leave it in the comments. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Until then, duel on.